Welcome to the Why Didn't I Know podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jenny Martin, and today we're talking about Epstein, the Vatican, and dark occult ritual. So the latest disclosure about the Epstein case involves some really disgusting practices. There's the aspect of sexually using children, and it just seems so hard to fathom for the average person. But here we are today with so much documentation coming out on the Epstein case that is implicating people on the left, on the right, members of royalty, you name it, in the most hideous, disgusting crimes. And it's not about sex for pleasure. If we think about it as just people wanting a hedonistic thrill, we're really missing the point. It goes a lot deeper than that. These are people that are practicing a ritual form of sex. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, because we haven't been told about this really dark occult side of sex, and we're about to be in an age of disclosure. And it might be surprising to some, but this does tie back to the Vatican. And Jeffrey Epstein himself was very well liked by the Vatican and had a good relationship with them. And as we will discuss today on this episode, that is not surprising at all. And to really unpack all this stuff, we need to understand where these sexual dark occult rituals come from. And that's my intention, to start unpacking that on this episode and explain to you where some of my own understanding came from. My own awakening to all of these connections didn't happen overnight. So I understand if some of you are listening to this episode and think, wow, that's really far-fetched or intense. I get it, because I did not come to this understanding in a day or a week. It's been a long time. And it started off when I first discovered the hidden relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail, came out in 1993, I believe. That book, which my partner gave to me, thankfully, because I just did not have that stuff on my radar at all. So back when I got that book, I was really intrigued by the relationship with Jesus and Magdalene. But what also intrigued me when I started to learn more about Margaret Starbird, the author's journey, and started to show up at her events when she was doing them live back in the day, what I learned was that she wasn't going to publish her book initially. She held off for a little bit. But then around that time, what happened was Pope John Paul I, he unexpectedly died after being in office for only 33 days. And anyway, something didn't add up for Starbird, and she writes about this in some of her more biographical works. It didn't add up for her because she thought nobody saw this coming. This guy didn't have any known health problems. And furthermore, there was conspiracy floating around at the time that he was going to be some kind of revolutionary change agent in the Vatican, in the church leadership. And then lo and behold, he is gone. And at that time when Starbird was sharing that, anyway, I mean, the good news is it got her to publish the book, because she thought, if they could take out a pope, they could hide the story about Mary and Jesus. It gave her the impetus to publish. And I heard that story about Pope John Paul back in the 90s, but it just sat in the back of my head. I didn't really think much of it. But over the last decade or so, I've been interested in what was that about. And I started to do some further looking into it. And I noticed there's some best-selling books that have been written on this topic because it is really suspicious. There was the sense for many people when it happened that his death was orchestrated. It wasn't random. And one of the books that came out was a best-selling nonfiction book by a British crime writer. And the book is called In God's Name, An Investigation into the Murder of Pope John Paul I. And this book talks about the fact that he was assassinated. And apparently, when his body was found, there was a note in his hand with the names of certain church officials that he was going to excommunicate. And why was he going to excommunicate? Because they were involved in dark occult practices. And there's another book, Murder in the 33rd Degree, by a Father Charles Theodore Murr. And he wrote about how Pope John Paul I had intended to bring reform to the church and get rid of a sinister occult influence that was happening within the Vatican itself. There's another book by an Eastern Orthodox priest called Papal Magic, Occult Practices Within the Catholic Church. And this book talks about that the mysterious death of this pope was an attempt to silence any exposure about the link between the Vatican and dark occult practices. Now, before I go any further, I'm using the word occult. And as some of you may know, occult simply means hidden. Occult in and of itself is not evil. However, there is dark occult and there is occult. Okay, so we're talking about the difference between black magic, which is summoning dark entities, and white magic or just alchemy. And that is not working with dark entities. Now, to really follow along with what I'm saying, we really need to understand that we are talking about a supernatural realm. We are not talking about you and your subconscious and your shadow self. This is really a view of the world being not just a physical place. And we're not taught that in our science class. We're not taught that in our education system at all today. But in another podcast, I'll explain how that has been left out, and the original science was alchemy from Isaac Newton. Anyway, so dark occult practices in the Vatican, and unfortunately, most of this discussion about the dark occult comes from the conservative Christian side. There's a book called Shadowland by a conservative Christian writer, and it talks about from Jeffrey Epstein to the Clintons to Obama and Biden to the occult elite exposing the deep state actors at war with Christianity, Donald Trump, and Americans' destiny. And this Christian author, Tom Horn, talks about dark occult, but he is linking paganism as occult. And that's just simply not where I'm coming from, and that's not accurate as far as my research goes. Paganism is not evil, and it is not dark occult. Unfortunately, the word occult is just a hard word for people to, it's a very polarizing word in today's world. But when I'm speaking about dark occult, I'm speaking about acts that involve ritual abuse, rape, and even human sacrifice. And that being actually linked to the Vatican, which is hard for many of us to understand if we've never been introduced to that. And what is important to realize is the original sexual sacrament from Yeshua and Magdalene was the flip opposite of that. It was love, devotion, connection with a higher power that was a benevolent, loving power. And there was no human sacrifice. There was no rape or torture. It was love and beauty and a connection with a very powerful force that is the divine. But when that got hidden, it got co-opted to be the flip opposite of that, the dark occult stuff that we see today. So when we're talking about that sexual act between Jesus and Magdalene to contact the higher power, we're talking about the Holy Communion. We're talking about the Eucharist. So when this sacrament between Yeshua and Magdalene got suppressed, it turned into something dark. So to further explain this whole concept, let me talk about the work of Father Malachi Martin. So Father Malachi Martin is no longer with us now, but he had insider knowledge on the Vatican. He was actually a member of the Vatican Intelligence Network before he chose to leave the church. He got an insider view of things, so much so that as a man of high integrity, once he found out that some of the top echelon in the Vatican were not actually aligned with God, they were actually aligned with a dark force. They worship the Antichrist, basically. And Father Malachi Martin, he wrote about the fact that, and by the way, he wrote this in his last published book called Windswept House, which was written as a novel, and I'll explain a little bit why he wrote it as a novel in a second. But one of the big revelations in that book was that there was something called the Black Mass that was performed by leaders within the Catholic Church in 1963. And in that book, he describes the Black Mass as a version of the Christian Mass, but it actually involved the rape and torture of a young woman, and it was intended to, it wasn't for some kind of hedonistic pleasure, it was on purpose to bring in connection to summon supernatural forces. But when you're doing rape and torture, you're not going to summon the good kind of forces. You're going to summon low vibrational forces. And they were looking for that occult power. They were looking for that definitely dark occult power through this Black Mass. And again, even though this book was a work of fiction, in a more recent book by Robert Morrow Jr., called Malachi Martin in the Shadows of the Vatican, published in 2025, Malachi's friend Morrow writes that he once asked Malachi Martin, why didn't you name those inside the Vatican that actually performed this Black Mass back in 1963? Why didn't you name them publicly anytime? And Malachi Martin said, because I want to keep my kneecaps. He was wise, and he knew that going to that extent could cost him his life. And as we'll see, it may have actually done that. But how did we even learn about this Black Mass? Father Martin shared with his friend Morrow Jr. that a clergy member involved in this ritual back in the 60s expressed real remorse for being involved in it when he was on his deathbed. And he asked for what's known in the Catholic tradition as absolution for his sins. He wanted to die and not know that this basically black mark was against him. And the priest that was there at his deathbed said, that is only possible on the condition that I have permission to share what you just divulged with me to other church leaders. And that's how we came to learn about this. Anyway, Father Martin died before he released his final book, which was intended to be nonfiction work that he was very passionate to write. Apparently, he told his literary agent this work of nonfiction that he was working on when he unexpectedly died was burning inside him. He had such a sense of urgency to get it done. And in the obituary written by his close friend, Father Charles Fiore, what we read in that obituary is that this book that he was unable to complete was a nonfiction work describing the underlying agenda for the Black Mass. The underlying agenda was to usher in a new world order, a totalitarian regime. And in Father Fiore's tribute to Malachi Martin, which you can still see today on Art Bell's website, he says, at his death, Father Martin was at work on what he said would be his most controversial and important book, Primacy: How the Institutional Roman Catholic Church Became a Creature of the New World Order. And it was to deal with power and the papacy. So that's a quote. And what we know is that Father Malachi died in the hospital after falling down some stairs. And his housekeeper, or the woman that gave him a place to live, described him saying that he was pushed by some kind of force. So we do not know more than that. So that's the interesting story about this Vatican insider. And he did get some information across to the public. He did various long interviews on the Art Bell show. And in one of his earlier books, he did discuss in the foreword to that book the topic of Black Mass. And he said that, and this was written back in 1999, he said that ritual sexual abuse is happening all over America. And the Black Mass ritual, which involves raping pretty much always a female victim, is not done for the purpose of some kind of sadistic pleasure. It is done with the intention of gaining supernatural power. So the fact that this has been happening for a long time underground, sometimes at the most highest level of our society, we are just beginning to understand the reality of that. There have been people that have been working in this area for decades and decades and decades and have been completely ignored. Unfortunately, when they do reach some level of exposure with their message, unfortunately, quite often they're silenced. An example of that is Wilfred Wong. He was, or he is, hopefully still alive, a lawyer in the UK, and he turned his focus about 27 years ago to focusing just on ritual sexual abuse and helping the victims. He found out that a lot of what we call dissociative identity disorder is really the result of this type of dark occult crime. These people were victimized by this crime, and no one took it seriously. He was speaking for a long time, as I said, in a low-key way, trying to educate the public, trying to bring awareness. He set up a nonprofit and so forth. And to all extents and purposes, when I watched him, there's an authenticity, there's a sincerity about him, and he's not on any conservative religious bandwagon or anything. He's just a down-to-earth, low-key guy. And one of the things that he has said is that it is what he calls VIP individuals, which is another word for elite, who get away with this crime most often. If you're a low-level actor doing these kinds of sadistic sexual crimes, you will get your ass in jail, but not if you can pay off the police and not if you're at a different level. So he went on, Wilfred Wong went on a rather well-viewed podcast, I think about a year or two ago. Unfortunately, it was a short time after that he got put in prison. And as the story goes, unfortunately, the internet is not a good place to do research, because if you look up this guy's name, you're going to see that he was responsible for the very crimes that he spent his entire life trying to help the victims of. You're going to see that he was imprisoned for these very things. I realize this is a really dark subject to speak on my podcast, but we are not living in a time where love and light is all there is. We are living in a time where there's a lot of darkness in the world. And until we find out what is underneath all that darkness, what is driving it, and we reclaim the original intention for sexuality, and part of talking about this stuff and bringing awareness is to realize that we need to change the consciousness of sexuality on the planet. And one of the things to realize is if these people who are engaged in these practices are realizing that sex is a portal to another world, but they're using it to bring in dark forces, how much more elevated would the frequency of this planet be if we got back to what Magdalene and Jesus were telling us, that there is a portal that can open through intentional ritual sexual practice when you do it in a loving, constructive, tapping into a divine force of love, not in this usury way that it's being done now. I'm unusual in this conversation because normally you're going to hear conservative Christians bringing up these topics of the dark occult. And I'm not a conservative Christian. I also teach alchemy, which is, you could say, according to some conservative Christians, it's all occult, it's all bad. Well, there is a distinction, and these lines have been blurred, unfortunately, and we're never going to get to the truth if we call it all the same. It's not the same. Alchemy, or another word for that, we could say is occult, can be dark and it can be light. It can destroy your soul if you're involved in a victim of one of these dark occult rituals, or it can elevate and bring a sense of ascension if you're involved in how it was originally intended in the other type of ritual experience. So there's a lot more on this to talk about, and I'm going to make a part 2 of this episode, so stay tuned. Please rate and review this podcast and share it with others. This information needs to be known. We need to get the word out, and thank you for helping with that. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.